So what I'm speaking about today is Jewish indigeneity. And this is a really important topic, particularly because really what we have happening in the world today is we have such a rebellion against God, Hashem, and such a rebellion that has targeted his chosen people, the Jewish people, the people of the book, the people of the Torah, the people of the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible. So what we've got is we've got this really incredible onslaught that is happening at the moment. And you've seen it particularly since October 7. Obviously it was there a long time before that, but it has increased dramatically since then. Even the Executive Council of Australian Jewry in Australia, which is a national representative body, has said that the cases that have come to them of anti-Semitism shows more than a 700% rise over the previous year. I mean, that is huge. And unfortunately, it is worldwide. Now, for us, because we are people of the book ourselves, we are people who are really very concerned about what's in the biblical account and are following the God of Israel, then this is really important to us, because I don't know what conversations you have with people, but surely you read the newspapers and watch the TV and see what is happening. Maybe you have some questions yourselves. Maybe you have some family members who are questioning you, or some friends who are saying, hey, what about this, what about that? And you may need to have some, shall we say, I won't use the word ammunition, although I did think of it, I have to admit. But, we are told in the Word of God that we need to have an answer for the questions that people ask us. And so this, I hope, message today will give you some of those answers. Now, you may not have thought too much about this, but we do have a lot of Indigenous people in our congregation as well. But really, everyone in the world is Indigenous to somewhere. We may not be living on the land that we're Indigenous to, but everyone is Indigenous. And Adam and Eve were the first Indigenous people to exist. Some people might debate that, but I think what needs to happen with Jewish people is they need to start getting involved in some of the United Nations organisations or forums where Indigenous people get together and discuss their issues. Now, I know the United Nations doesn't have a very good record, particularly with Israel. That's a matter of fact, which I'm not going into details today. But it's important because it is such a contested area today, saying that Jewish people are not Indigenous, where in fact they are. And so they need to start recognising that themselves, if they don't already, and take part in some of these international forums with other Indigenous people. I think it's quite critical. So the question is, are Jewish people Indigenous to Israel? Well, it would seem rather obvious, because the name Jews comes from Judea, previously Judah, and that's where Jesus, or Yeshua, was born, in Judea. However, it is a contested fact. And so some people, and you've probably heard them on the news, demonstrating in our streets, who are saying that the Jewish people have colonised Israel. That is simply not the case. You know, they say they are a settler colonial nation. In fact, the Jewish people have resettled Israel. They have decolonised Israel, even though there has always been a remnant living in the land. And so really, so the Jewish people must be about the most colonised people in the world, because they've had the Egyptians, the Assyrians, the Greeks, the Babylonians, the Romans, and a number of Islamic invaders, including the Ottoman Turks, who ruled for 400 years before World War I, and then we had the British Mandate. So there's been wave upon wave of colonisation of Israel and the Jewish people, and there have been exiles as well. They've been taken into exile, and so really would have to be the most colonised people and nation in existence, and yet here they are facing the charge of being a settler colonial state. So I think it's important that we raise that. And so one of the other things is, I think you would find this really interesting. I'm going to read this out to you. This is a statement by Ryan Bellerose, who's a Métis Indigenous activist. So they are North American Indians or First Nations people. And he said the achievement of self-determination in the creation of the nation-state of Israel is something no other Indigenous people has ever accomplished in the history of the world. And that's an amazing statement. And there's certainly a lot to that statement, I believe. However, one could say that there are other nations who have decolonised, and some of those may be considered a third world, some may be considered fourth world or indigenous, but we're not going to go there now. However, I think it's worth mentioning that particular observation. And so, you know, what we have here, I believe we've got the politics of envy, we've got the politics of hate, we've got the politics of sectarianism, and we've got the politics of self-righteousness happening here. And it's a matter of calling good evil and evil good. So people are actually stating the opposite of what is actually happening. And I think if we have a look at it here, what we've also got happening is a false morality, and we've got a moral superiority, and we've got a saviour kind of complex, and we've got pride. All these things are happening in the protest movements around the world and in the people who are opposing the Jewish state. And they're saying, oh, well, we're not anti-Semitic, we're just anti-Zionist, because the Zionists are colonisers because they want their own state. Well, you know, really, how could Jewish people colonise themselves? They haven't. And why is it that the Jewish people, of all the people in the world, are not allowed self-determination? You know, it just doesn't make sense. The arguments are false narratives based on ahistorical facts. And so I think one of the issues behind all of this is that when we had the Holocaust, for example, we had the shameful situation of the Nazis killing 6 million Jews, and we won't go into the horrible things that happened during that time, but Jewish people were seen as victims then by the left, and so there was some sympathy for them in the re-establishment of the State of Israel at that time after World War II. However, the Jewish people have become successful at rebuilding the State of Israel, rebuilding the ancient state of Israel into the modern state of Israel. And so there's this jealousy, this envy, and this criticism of them that, oh, they're white, even though only some of the Jews came from Europe. A lot of them came from other parts of the world. But there's that criticism, oh, they're white, oh, they're successful, so they must be the oppressor. And so the whole narrative has changed from the Jewish people being a victim group, an oppressed group, to them being an oppressor group. And just going back to the bit about Jewish people are white, therefore they must be bad, or an oppressor, or they must have ripped off someone and that's why they're successful and well off, never mind hard work or ingenuity or creativity. What we have here is there were the same number of Jewish people, refugees from Arab lands in the Middle East and North Africa, than that there were Jewish refugees from Europe, approximately 750,000 in each case. And that is often forgotten. Also the fact that Jewish people are of all different colours. We have Ethiopian Jews, for example. So we have many Jews called Mizrahis, for example. They're not all white European descent. In fact, Israel must be about the most multicultural nation in the world. So there's a lot of false narratives and ahistorical facts, as I said. And so what we have now is Jewish people are seen not as the victims, but as the conquerors, because they've been successful. Every time they've been attacked by Arab nations, they've been able to defend themselves successfully. But that's the key thing. They have defended themselves. They have not started any of these wars. And yet they've been criticised so much, including by our own government, etc., criticised because of defending themselves. And yet, are they expected just to lay down and die and see their families killed? You cannot expect that of a nation or a people group anywhere in the world. And so I think it's important to realise that not only has Israel not started any wars, and the Arabs have started many wars against them, Jewish people have never colonised any other nation. Now we know that through history there have been many nations, black nations, white nations, when we're talking about predominantly population, have colonised through history. It's a fact of history. But the Jewish people have never, ever colonised another nation. And people keep forgetting that, but I think it's important. So the other thing is that people in the West, particularly academics, uni students, teachers, protesters, etc. They seem to be very obsessed with Western colonialism, forgetting that there have been Islamic colonialists, there have been black colonialists. There's all different shades of cultures through centuries that have been colonialists, but they are obsessed with white colonialists, Western colonialists, and they are obsessed with Israel because they see Israel aligned with the West. And so that is a real issue as well. And the Palestinians, I think it's important to point out, are not Indigenous, and we know that some Indigenous Australian activists, for example, are identifying themselves, people like Lydia Thorpe is one example, but identifying themselves with the Palestinian cause because they're saying, well, the Palestinians are Indigenous, we're Indigenous Australians, so our causes must be the same. And might I add, there's been a lot of money poured in by Palestinian activists to promoting that kind of thinking. But the Palestinians are not Indigenous to Israel. They have no ethnic relationship to the ancient Canaanites, for example, who have disappeared from history, and no ethnic relationship at all to the Philistines, who have also disappeared from history, might I add, a very long time ago. Apparently the Philistines in the 6th century, so it's a long time ago. So I think it's important to say also that the United Nations tried to sort this out in 1947 by having a petition plan of the British Mandate area and into a Jewish state and an Arab state. Now, mind you, it didn't say a Palestinian state because the Palestinian people did not exist at that point. That was a later invention or development, however way you want to look at it. But it was between the Jews and the Arabs, 2 states. The Jews accepted it, even though it meant a loss of land that they would have liked, but the Arabs did not accept it. Jordan was also set up. Some of the land actually previously went to Jordan. That was part of Israel as well. So really, you could say Jordan was really meant to be the Palestinian state, but that's another story. I think the important thing here to mention is that Israel has always supported a 2-state solution, and there have been many attempts to get that over the years, and it's been the Arabs who have rejected it every time, including latterly the ones who now identify as Palestinians. Okay. So, after saying all of that, how do you decide if a group of people is Indigenous or not? So I think it's important to have a look at that. So there are actually 5 main areas, and there was someone called Martinez Cobo, who was an Ecuadorian anthropologist who was selected by the United Nations to do a study for them on Indigenous people. And he basically came up with 5 main areas that would indicate whether a group was Indigenous or not. And they only had to tick 1 box, okay? And so these were occupying ancestral lands was number 1. Number 2 was having ancestry in common with the original inhabitants. Number 3 was a culture that was developed and associated with that land. Number 4, language associated with that land. And number 5, residence. And so we know that the Jewish people have been in the land for about 4,000 years, continuous residency. So let's have a look at each of those just very briefly. So that first one, occupation of ancestral lands, and this was ratified again by the UN in 2004 at a permanent forum on Indigenous affairs. I know it's a long time ago now because we're 2024, but this was the latest I was able to find, and it's still current. So number 1, occupation of ancestral lands, or at least part of them. So when we have a look at that, although there have been all these colonisation of Jewish people over the centuries, there has always been a remnant in the land, okay? And there also is a group called the Allied Voices of Israel who has done a little bit of work on this as well, which is worth you while having a look at. So we know Abraham came to the land 4,000 years ago, and we know also that he bought the cave of patriarchs in Hebron, which was going to be a burial place for him and his family. And so it was also a burial place of Sarah, Rebecca, Jacob and Leah. So, you know, the structure which sits above the cave dates back to the 1st century BC. And we also know King David ruled in Jerusalem 3,000 years ago. And there's an interesting quote here from Mahindra von Sigi, an Indigenous advocate, and he said, Judaism is a land-based cultural religion. We have had a spiritual and stewardship relationship with the land of Israel since the beginning of our collective memory. Land relationships and stewardship is a critical foundation for any tribe's indigeneity. And look, that's a really important point, because we know that the feasts of Israel, or the feasts in the Bible, are agriculturally centered feasts. And so a lot of the religious and spiritual life Israel is based around the agricultural feasts and is tied to that particular land. So although Jewish people and some Christians worldwide commemorate the feasts, they actually are tied to a piece of land and the fruits that are available at that particular time in that agricultural season. And so now we look at number 2, common ancestry with the original occupants of the land. And so look, we know that the Israelites were actually not the first people in the land of Israel. The Canaanites were also a Semitic people. And so some people might say, well, how can the Jewish people be considered indigenous when the Canaanites were actually there first? The thing is, the Canaanites actually don't exist anymore as a collective culture. The people don't exist, the culture doesn't exist, the language doesn't exist. So that means that the Jewish people are in fact the oldest surviving original inhabitants of the land that we call Israel. The other thing it's important to notice really that sub-Saharan Africa is considered by researchers to be kind of the cradle of Christianity, the cradle of humanity, and we know it as the Garden of Eden, as that cradle. So all the nations, all the peoples groups actually went out from there to populate the world. So in one sense, we're all migrants. It depends how you might look at it. Except maybe some Africans who are still in that area. So, often it just depends the way you look at something. And sometimes, we get set in our ways and only look, in a certain way. And we don't, they put those on horses. They put those, I don't know what they're called. I just thought of that now, those blinkers on it anyway, so they can't be looking everywhere. But, we need to be thinking people. We need to be looking around and assessing what we're seeing and hearing to see if it actually stacks up. So there was a journalist who spoke about indigeneity, and he said, his name was Matthew Gindon, and this is a quote. He said, "All people ultimately come from somewhere else. What makes the people indigenous to a place is their having become a people in that land and having all the earmarks of a unique culture associated with that place. The Jews became a people in Israel." And Dr. Cherie Trotter, who some of you may have seen on our Zoom seminars, she's a Maori leader, and she said, well, the Maoris were not the first peoples in New Zealand, but they became a people in New Zealand. They developed their culture in New Zealand relating to that land. And there were no Indigenous people before them that are surviving. So they, the Maori people, are considered the Indigenous people of New Zealand. And that was an interesting point. Also, the Rambam Medical Centre in Haifa, and also the Technikon Israel Institute of Technology successfully mapped the Jewish genome, and they said that 90% of Jewish people are genetically linked to the Levant, which is the Middle East. So, third point, culture in general, or specific manifestations such as religion, living under a tribal system, membership of an Indigenous community, dress, means of livelihood, lifestyle, etc. And so, of course, we know that we have the 12 tribes of Israel. There's a distinctive dress, especially of the religious. The lifestyle revolves around the biblical feasts, even for secular Jews, because it's part of their culture and tradition. We know that religious prayers recited by observant Jews 3 times a day call for the return to Israel, and most synagogues point in the direction of Jerusalem, and there's a lot more to it, but that just gives you some idea on that one. And so number 4, language, whether used as the only language, as a mother tongue, as the habitual means of communication at home or in the family, or as the main preferred habitual, general or normal language. So this is from the UN that I'm reading out, and originally from Kobo. So when you have a look at that, you can see that Hebrew is the national language, and it has persisted over thousands of years. And even when the Jewish people were exiled and in the diaspora, when they developed Yiddish and Ladino, depending where they were, those languages are based on Hebrew as well. So, number 5, residents on certain parts of the country or in certain regions of the world. So today about half the world's Jews live in Israel. I'd say with the anti-Semitism that's occurring worldwide, many more are making Aliyah at the moment. So I think it's important to realise that I've said before that Jews have had a presence since 4,000 years. So that's pretty long residence, okay? A couple of quotes before ending. Muhammad bin Jara al-Tabiri, from 839 to 923 CE, which is also AD. He was a Muslim historian and he wrote about the Muslim conquest of Jerusalem. They were approaching, quote, the area where the Romans buried the temple at the time of the sons of Israel. So, that was a Muslim witness at the particular time of the Jewish presence. The Supreme Muslim Council of Jerusalem in 1924 CE or AD, the quote was, "The site is one of the oldest in the world. Its sanctity dates from the earliest times. Its identity with the site of Solomon's temple is beyond dispute." So this was the Supreme Muslim Council of Jerusalem. So, they know. They know that they built on top of the Jewish temple. And so I think just a couple of points in closing, and I think this is rather interesting that in the time that the Jordan was in charge of Jerusalem between 1948 and 1967, not one Arab leader visited Jerusalem, and not one person from the Saudi royal family went and prayed at Al-Aqsa Mosque. So although they say that that's the third holiest site in Islam, we know it is the most holy, the first holy site for Jewish people. However, there is still contention over that, as you would know. It's also worth noting that even though the early Zionist settlers who returned and rebuilt in 1881 to 1914, they did call themselves settlers and they did call themselves colonists because they were resettling the land. But it had an entirely different meaning from what people are using it today that I discussed earlier. Also, because they weren't taking someone else's land for economic gain, they weren't dominating a local population, and they weren't, like colonialism is transplanting people from a foreign nation to a land to control it. That was not what was happening. So just one more point there. In 1892, there were 61.9% of the population of Jerusalem was Jewish. And we often get led to believe that the Arabs were in majority in Jerusalem, but the Political Dictionary of the State of Israel, as I said, says it's nearly 62% Jewish at that particular time. So I've got a lovely quote that I'd like to end with from Theodore Herzl, As you know, he was the father of modern Zionism. And look, Zionism is, many people see it as a dirty word. It is simply the right of the Jewish people to live in their ancient homeland and have a state of their own. That's all it is. Simple as that. Okay? So Theodore Herzl, Zionism's founding father, who in his famous letter to Arab notable Yusuf Zia al-Khalidi wrote, quote, "Who would think of sending Arabs away? It's their well-being, their individual wealth that we would increase in bringing our own." And so we know, as the modern Zionists resettled Israel, many Arabs came in because of the economic opportunities that were provided by the Jewish settlers. And that's often forgotten, that there was a lot of Arab migration at that time as well, following on Jewish migration. So I'm going to leave it at that, and I will be developing some prayer points out of this to send to you as well. So God bless you. Thank you for listening.